Awesome. Thank you guys so much for joining us here this evening. My name is Holly Grand. I am going to be facilitating the webinar this evening. Just a few reminders before we get started. Your cameras, microphones, and chat are all going to be disabled during this webinar. If you have any questions at all during the presentation, please make sure to use that Q&A feature that's located at the bottom of your screen in Zoom. We will answer all questions at the end of the presentation, but please feel free to type in any questions that you have into that Q&A box at any point during the webinar at all. If you would like to provide comment about the proposed mariculture site this evening, you must email them to the designated email address, which we'll show you a few more times during this webinar this evening. It was on the intro slides as well, but if you missed that, just look out for it a little bit later. We will not be taking any comments about the proposed site through Zoom. You must do that through the email address that is going to be provided. Contact information, all of that is going to be shown on the screen at various points during this webinar. And I think with that, I'm going to hand it over to Zach Olson.
Thanks, Holly. Thank you all for tuning in tonight. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here to get the presentation started. Well, again, thank you all for coming out tonight to this Cultivated Oyster Mariculture public hearing for application G0001, which is a grow out facility in Copano Bay. My name is Zach Olson. I'm the ecosystem leader for the Aransas Bay, Copano Bay ecosystem for Texas Parks and Wildlife Department. Y'all already met Holly, who will be facilitating the meeting tonight. And then also we have Emma Clarkson, who is on the line to help facilitate the question answer portion of the presentation tonight. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. Before we jump into the formal presentation, I just want to start with just a couple of words on the purpose of the public hearing tonight. Number one, because this is the first public hearing for a cultivated oyster mariculture site in Texas, I do just want to take a couple minutes to just provide a little bit of information on what cultivated oyster mariculture is. Certainly won't be a how-to presentation, but it'll really just give anybody who just has no idea what mariculture is just an idea of exactly what we're talking about. Number two, we're going to be providing some information on this specific proposed cultivated oyster mariculture grow out facility in Copano Bay. And then number three, we hope to gather public comment on this proposed facility. As Holly said, please email any comments you have. I'll show that email address at the end of the presentation. This public comment period is part of the mariculture permitting process. And so we will take into account any comments that we gather tonight as part of the permitting process. So let's start out with just a little bit of background about cultivated oyster mariculture. Texas Parks and Wildlife Department really just started accepting applications for cultivated oyster mariculture in September of 2020. So this is a very, very new program. Like I said, this is the first facility that has made it to the public hearing process. And for those of you that really are just unsure what mariculture is, just a couple of bullets there on that. In general, oyster mariculture involves taking oyster seed from hatcheries, oyster hatcheries, that are then stocked into floating or suspending cages. Those cages are then placed in public waters for growth to a harvestable size. As part of that mariculture process, cages and oysters are typically worked and cleaned to produce a more valuable product. And then, like I said, they're allowed to grow in public waters to a harvestable size, and then those oysters then enter the food market typically. So the picture you're looking at on your screen now is a typical cultivated oyster mariculture grow out facility. What you see kind of floating on the water surface are floating cages. Inside those cages are oysters that are suspended in the water column. And that's a key point. This is off bottom mariculture. So these oysters are not resting on the bottom. They are suspended in the water column. And sometimes floating outside of the water for desiccation and cleaning practices used in mariculture. So we'll kind of move on then to some just specifics about this particular proposed site in Copano Bay. This is a map of Copano Bay you're looking at, and the proposed site is that kind of red dot, kind of in the western portion of Copano Bay, just outside the mouth of Port Bay. We'll zoom into that a little bit. The red box is the proposed site. That's an 8-acre site. And the proposed access route to that site is the dashed red line that runs into Port Bay and actually ends up at a private pier that the applicant will be using for their operations. Just some more details on the site itself and then the operations plan that the applicant has provided to us. Number one, this site is in Texas Harvest Area TX32, which is approved waters for oyster harvest. As I mentioned, the extent of this site is 8 acres. The water depth is 7 to 8 feet, and the distance from shore is approximately 1,000 feet. The proposed gear to be used on site is a floating cage system. And the number of floating cages on site will range from 693 to 4,059 floating cages. And that's a minimum operations and a maximum operations number of cages there. These floating cages are 60 inches by 36 inches by 23 inches each. And these cages are organized in rows and anchored to the bay bottom. I'll show some additional schematics here in a second just to help you visualize that. The seed type and source, we are talking about American oysters. So this is a native oyster species found in Texas and the Gulf of Mexico. In fact, we only allow the native American oyster to be used for mariculture in Texas. The applicant has proposed using both diploid and triploid oysters, diploid referring to reproductively viable oysters, triploid referring to reproductively non-viable oysters, so sterile oysters. And we do require Texas native broodstock to be used. So as I mentioned earlier, these oysters are spawned in a hatchery, and those are what's stocked into these cages. And so we do require Texas native oysters to be used for that spawning. And the source hatchery will follow all genetic and biosecurity protocols as outlined by TPWD. Just some more typical on-site operations. The applicant will be accessing that site via boat and will be conducting pretty much all of the operations via boat just because of that water depth, 7 to 8 foot. They propose daily site visitations for just general tending and maintenance and monitoring, weather permitting, at least weekly biofouling control via desiccation of the cages and onshore pressure washing, weekly onshore tumbling, sorting, and calling of oysters. Non-lethal bird deterrent systems have also been proposed. That essentially boils down to a telescoping pole and kite system that's going to be used to help deter birds from the gear. The applicant will be required to mark the facility via U.S. Coast Guard requirements. And the applicant also has a hurricane plan in place as part of the operations plan to avoid gear loss during a storm event. So the next couple of slides we're going to be looking at are really just kind of profile views of what a floating cage system typically looks like. And I'll be showing that cage system in a couple of different orientations that are common for oyster mariculture practices. So what you're looking at now is a feeding position. And so what you're seeing here is the oysters are suspended in the water column by kind of a floating oyster cage flotation at the top. These cages are each, as I mentioned earlier, anchored to an anchor line that runs the length of each row of cages. And then a helix anchor is then used to anchor each row of cages. I believe it's a minimum of 32-inch depths into the sediment. And then each row is marked with a navigational buoy. Here we have really the same type of setup, except now it's a flipped position. So there's oyster cages on top outside of the water. That's typically what is used for desiccating those cages for gear cleaning, that sort of thing. And then finally, we have a submerged position. This is typically what you see during a storm event. Those oyster floats are filled with water and allowed to sink, and then those cages can hopefully weather the storm that way. What you're seeing now is a sky view of the minimum operations for the 8-acre site. Those rows, each row of lines and dots, those dots represent individual cages. And this is, again, the minimum operation view you're looking at here. This is 623 cages throughout the 8-acre site. You can see there's equipment staging and work lanes worked into that design as well. This is the maximum operations plan. So that's 4,049 cages, just a little bit denser array, but you can see still that there's equipment staging and work lanes throughout that 8-acre facility. So next we'll talk about the Natural Resource Survey. Texas Parks and Wildlife Department requires all oyster mariculture applicants to complete a natural resource survey, and the purpose of that is really twofold. Firstly, we really just want to make sure that these facilities aren't going to be impacting any habitats, namely seagrass habitat, oyster habitat, and also bird rookeries. And secondly, we use this as an opportunity to just determine if there's any user conflict in the area that may come into play with these proposed sites. So the Natural Resource Survey consists of 2 steps, and the applicant has already completed both of these steps. Number 1 is a pre-consultation with TPWD field staff, really just looking at existing habitat maps to look at any potential habitat impacts we may have, but also other potential known uses of the bay system to avoid other uses such as oil and gas, such as commonly navigated shorelines by boaters, channels, things like that. And then once we have a site that we feel is not impacting habitats and minimizing user conflict, we then require the applicant to perform an on-site habitat survey. This particular habitat survey was a side scan sonar survey with a number of ground samples for validation. TPW does provide the methodology for that survey, just so we know it's a standardized type survey. TPW requires a minimum buffer of 200 foot of any mariculture facility from seagrass habitat, minimum of 500 foot from any oyster habitat, and a minimum of 2,000 foot from any bird rookeries. And what the findings of this natural resource survey ultimately were is that there is no seagrass in the 200-foot buffer, no oyster habitat in the 500-foot buffer, no established rookeries within the 2,000-foot buffer. So what you're seeing here is really just a mapped version of what we just talked about. The mariculture site is the red box. 200-foot buffer is the white line. The 500-foot buffer is the black line, and the seagrass is the green line. Oyster habitat is in pink there as well. So just the next steps. We'll be continuing to look at public comments until Friday, so please submit any comments you have via email. And then the applicant will then need to work with a number of other state and federal agencies to finalize this permit. Please see the Parks and Wildlife website for any future applications and for more information on oyster mariculture. And then this is the email address that you'll need to email any comments you have. So with that, I'll turn it over for any questions that anybody might have.
So I'm not seeing any questions in the Q&A. Remember everyone, that Q&A is going to be at the bottom of your screen. If you have any questions at all about anything that we covered, go ahead and type those into that and we will get to them as you type them in.
Hi everyone, my name is Emma. I'm going to be helping with the questions and answers, helping answer some of these. So we have our first question. I'm going to answer it live. It says, if someone wanted to submit a similar plan, what is the best first step? Reaching out to TPWD for consultation? And so yes, you can either reach out to Parks and Wildlife, and we'll usually give you the background information of how you can work through the process, what the permitting requirements are, what the next steps are. We'll even look at the maps with you to kind of look at your site and your area and talk about the ecology, the salinity in the area, things like that. And if we see any seagrass or oyster concerns that we are aware of in that area, and that's always a good place to start. The other option is to start with Sea Grant, Mario Marquez. He's also kind of helps look at things from more of a business perspective. It'll be an opportunity to look at, ask questions about how big should my farm be, what kind of gear, what are some of the things I should consider when looking. It really depends on how far along you are with the process, but both of those are those are the best places to start. The next question is, what was the main driver for the site chosen? I'm going to go ahead and punt that to you, Zach. If you're there. Yep, there we go.
Yeah, one second, let me turn on my video here. Yeah, so main driver really is as you can imagine, there's a lot of stipulations, as I mentioned, for selecting these sites. We don't like to have them overlap with any sort of seagrass, oyster, bird rookery habitat. There's a lot of potential for user conflict with oil and gas and things like that in our bays. Really, some of the main stipulations are really just finding areas that don't conflict with habitat and any sort of other user conflict. And there's honestly, there's fairly limited space in some of our bay systems. And so that's really one of the main considerations. Some of the other things that we talk about when we do a consultation with an applicant involves, we'll typically provide salinity and dissolved oxygen data from the Parks and Wildlife data set to kind of help the applicant choose locations that they think may be favorable for oyster growth. But things that we're interested in terms of Parks and Wildlife is we're primarily interested in really minimizing any sort of habitat disturbance with these sites.
Thank you, Zach. And just to add to that, the applicant will often have their own kind of set of things that they're interested in as well. Usually it's access to some sort of property, docking station, facility where they can bring their product to land. If they have a boat ramp they prefer to use, there's distance from, if you're planning on selling your product to a dealer, how far away that is. So, you can get your product in there in time, especially in the heat of the summer. So there's a lot of business decisions. We can't speak on behalf of the applicant to say exactly why they wanted that site, but those are types of things that applicants are typically considering is, do I have access to, the property that I need for my land-based operations, which they're usually paired with. That's where you tumble and sort and things like that. The second question that we have, or the third, how many oysters can be raised or grown on a lease? I'll go ahead and answer this one. We don't have a maximum number of oysters that can be raised, but we do have a minimum. There's a minimum use criteria for all oyster mariculture sites, and that is 100,000 seeds per acre per year. And so that's something to keep in mind if you guys are interested in you have to stock at least that much annually. In terms of how much can you go, I think that's kind of a business decision. Those are the kind of questions we usually refer to Mario because he can usually answer, what your production rate will be like. But that's not usually something that we get involved in those answers. So clear that one. We don't have any more questions right now, but I'm going to pause for a minute just to see if anybody is still typing. Okay, we have another question. What is the recommended seeding and growing season? My understanding of these processes is that they will be seeded and grown year round. Zach, do you want to add to that?
No, I think you covered it. Yeah, that's my understanding as well.
It's pretty straightforward, sorry. We have warm temperatures here. The growth rate of oysters in Texas is a bit higher than in other parts of the Gulf. And so that actually allows for year-round growing, harvest, rapid growth, things like that. One thing to consider is that in the middle of summer, all oyster mariculture operations must conform to the requirements set by the Texas State Department of State Health Services. And so there is a time temperature matrix. So, it's kind of a matrix that you look at, and given the air temperature, there's a time to refrigeration requirement. And so in the dead of summer, in the hottest months, it's usually about an hour that you have to have your product from the time it leaves the cage into the water into refrigeration is 1 hour. So that is one consideration when planning your growing season. I'll pause again to see if there are any more questions. There aren't any in the question and answer box right now. Okay, 2 more questions. Any idea how quickly this permit might be cleared and able to start planting seeds? I'm going to answer that live. So this all depends on the public comment. As Holly pointed out, we are taking public comments through the email address that is on screen there. So it depends on how many we get, what other considerations we might have to look at. If we get, say in the case that we get no public comments, nobody has any issue with the site, it will probably be a fairly rapid process. Probably within 2 to 3 weeks. We usually give it a month to a month and a half per permit application to go through the entire process. And we're already about 3 to 4 weeks through this process. The next question, what is approximately the growth cycle length? My understanding is that some of the farms, some of the experimental farms in Texas, or just operations, have a very, very quick time to maturity. I believe it's within about 6 months. Zach, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, it's much shorter. I mean, in a wild oyster will take typically just under 2 years, about 2 years to grow to harvestable size, but mariculture oysters can grow much faster, as Emma suggested. And that's for two reasons. Number one, because of the fact that a lot of these oysters are actually triploid, as I mentioned earlier. Harvesters or mariculture operators have the option of using triploid oysters, which are essentially sterile, reproductively sterile, which means that they essentially put more metabolic energy into growing meat and growing shell and that sort of thing. So they can grow to a harvestable size faster. And then just really the mariculture operations tends to make an oyster growth a little bit more efficient than you typically see in the wild. So I think that's correct.
Thank you, Zach. And another thing to note is that the harvest size for mariculture oysters is smaller than wild oysters. So we're only talking about 2.5 inches instead of 3. So it's a little bit of a shorter amount of time to get to that target. And John just asked, what size oysters will be harvested? Will small oysters be allowed from the farms, or do they fall within the normal harvest guidelines? I just addressed that. It's 2.5 inches for mariculture oysters. For those of you who may be concerned about the different sizes, there are a lot of rules prohibiting commingling of mariculture and wild oysters. You can't have a dredge on the boat for mariculture operations. So they will be distinguishable between the two. So it is 2.5 for mariculture, 3 for wild. Okay, perfect. Okay, the next question is, how much is it to purchase a lease? So for parks and wildlife, it is $450 an acre a year, but that is just for parks and wildlife fees. There, you do also have to get a GLO lease in the process, and I'm not aware of what the GLO fees are going to be. But for parks and wildlife fees, it's $450 an acre a year, and a $200 application fee. I'll pause again to see if there are any more questions. And I just got an answer from the GLO in the chat, in the Q&A, saying that the GLO will charge a $50 application fee and $1,500 per acre per year. So there's the rest of that answer. How much approximately for gear is the next question. I actually do not have a good handle on that answer. Zach, do you happen to know how much approximately for the gear?
No, I really don't, and I would say that's probably a question more for our Sea Grant partners, Mario. So that would be something you could follow up with them on.
Follow-up question, are those fees recurring annually regardless of the term of the lease? The lease terms are all 10 years, and yes, they are annual fees. Okay, we have another question. Is there a limit to the number of permits that will be approved? At this point in time, Parks and Wildlife is not enforcing any limit on number or size of farms. So it's unlimited size and number of farms. Next question, I'm not really sure that I can answer this. We'll see if Zach can. What is the expected market value for a 2.5-inch oyster? Zach, do you happen to know? I
really don't. I know that they're typically sold for a higher price on market than your typical wild caught oyster. Most of those oysters go to the half shell. Most of these mariculture oysters go to the half shell market. So I can tell you it's more than your typical wild oyster, but I couldn't give you a number, no.
I want to say that I've seen $2 per oyster in other states, but I don't quote me on that. That's something that we can certainly find out and get back to you. And if you have these questions and we're not, giving satisfactory answers, please feel free to email that address that you see there, Oyster Mariculture, with your question, and we can find those answers and get back to you with them. Okay, no more questions. Oh. How does reaching out to Sea Grant work? Are they consultants? No, Sea Grant's not a consultant. They are a mixed agency. It's like a partnership agency with the university. So if you email the address there that you see, oyster.mariculture, I can send you the contact information of people who can help you with those, like I said, those business operations and those aspects of it. So just send an email to that email address right there. That goes to me, and I will send out the contact information as needed. So that is the end of our question and answer section. And like I said, if you have any more questions, you think of something later, if you want a more in-depth answer, please don't hesitate to email that address there and provide any comments that you may have about this proposed site at that email address as well. Holly, I'm going to turn it back over to you now.
Yeah, and everyone who attended here or who has registered for the webinar this evening will be receiving a follow-up email that has that email address in there as well, just in case you didn't write it down or you lose it in between now and then. You can still, find it in that email address that you'll get from Zoom tomorrow at some point. I think we're good to go. Anything else, Emma, Zach? No?
Nope,
Good.
I don't think so.
All right, perfect. Cool. Well, thank you guys so much for joining us this evening. We appreciate it a lot. Again, reach out to us if you have any questions about any of this or the proposed site at all. And cool. We'll see you guys later.